Hello, everyone, and welcome to Colorful Pixels, the show where I talk with the people behind the pixels. I'm Carmen Askerneese, your host, and today I'm joined by James Mielke. Hi, James. Welcome to the show.
Hi. Thanks for having me here.
Of course, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. So, one of the things I always like to do at the start of our episodes is ask our guest, do you remember the very first time that you either played or encountered video games?
Yeah, I'm a little foggy on which came first, but the one that stands out to me the most is when I walked into a department store in my town growing up, and they had a Space Invaders cabinet, and all these kids were huddled around the cabinet, just kind of like leaning over and crowding around this thing. And of course, when I saw that, I was fascinated, and I was like, "What's this all about?" So I walked up, kind of got my way in there, and saw what was going on, and I was just amazed at that moment, and I think that instantly had its hooks in me. So after that, it was the first thing we got at home was Pong, and then my relatives in Japan sent me some Game and Watches, which were not out in the States for a couple of years, and it just sort of snowballed from there. So, but Space Invaders was the first one.
That's awesome. Did you get a chance to play?
I did. I did eventually. Coming by quarters at that age was not an easy thing. Mom, give me some money for what? I want to go play this game. That just didn't compute at the time. But I eventually got there. But I was terrible at it, so the experience didn't last long. But it was just enough to kind of spark that craze.
Oh man, it probably was a hard sell. Like, I want to play this game.
Yeah, for what? For 30 seconds? 25 cents. Even to my parents, they were just like, "What are you doing? You're just throwing money away." I'm like, "No, you got to give me 25 cents." But yeah, I eventually got there, and then I started bringing my money to the department store whenever we would go by on weekends. I try to get some time in. Yeah, it was just an amazing thing. Just the audio, the sound of like pew pew pew, and the visuals, the cabinet, the marquee, the big Space Invader guy on the side. It was pretty wild.
Oh man, you know, I remember when I was a kid. I feel like there were arcade cabinets in laundromats, but in department stores, I didn't know that. I kind of wish that was still a thing because I just like walking around a department store and finding an arcade cabinet would be awesome.
Yeah, you say that now, and it does sound weird. Like I'm used to the laundromats too, where they had Miss Pac-Man and Galaga. That was like the ones for laundromats. But yeah, this is like when I say department store, I don't mean something upscale like Macy's. It was more like a small town Kmart or something like that. But you know, oddly enough, they at first they just had the Space Invaders, but eventually by the time like we hit peak 80s, they had about four or five cabinets, like with stuff like Karate Champ and Burger Time and stuff like that. They had like five arcade machines side to side to side, all by the checkout counter. So I mean that was a perfect place because it wasn't in anybody's way. You know, the kids would all hang out there and probably stay out of their parents' hair. It was actually a pretty interesting time.
That's so cool. Did you go to arcades a lot as a kid too?
Yeah, there was an arcade at a mall, typical mall, had the Orange Julius, had all Chess King. This was the 80s, so, Chess King, Ocean Pacific, stuff like that. Those are good times, and there was an arcade there, and I spent so much time in there playing Forgotten Worlds, Hang On, Afterburner, stuff like that, all the early Sega and Capcom games. And in hindsight, I feel bad because my mom had to wait there for me, and I just lost all track of time. She would be sitting there. She was a saint. She'd be sitting there for like 2 hours waiting for me to get my little ass out of that arcade. But I made that money go a long ways. Um, but yeah, those I feel lucky to be able to have experienced that culture.
That's really sweet that she waited though.
Yeah, she wasn't happy about it, but she did wait because what was she gonna do? Abandon her only child?
My mom was definitely like, "We're leaving now." And even when I had the home consoles, I was like, "Oh, I don't have like a memory card or whatever." She's like, "Well, you're gonna have to do it later because we're leaving."
Oh man,
The
so you
struggle.
had to just leave it on.
Yeah, sometimes I try to just leave it on, running the electric bill up, and hopefully the game doesn't crash when I come back home.
Exactly.
before autosaving, it was hard out here. So I wanted to follow up about, you mentioned having, a console and, like, starting to get into playing games at home too. Do you think there was a game experience you had where you thought to yourself, "I wanna make these?"
That's an interesting question because back in those days, it never really seemed like a viable career path, And, I mean, I think it's something that even kids nowadays, they look at the video game industry and they don't necessarily think this is what I want to do and here's the path forward for me. I actually do a lot of outreach where I live now, which is in New Zealand, and I I basically go out to these job fairs and I talk to kids about how they could get into the game industry and what they would need to do if they wanted to, what they would need to study, the things that they would you know, first identifying what they would want to do. Would you want to be a programmer, an animator, a 3D artist, a composer, whatever, and then try to help them calibrate their university choices, for example, and how to go forward. Back in the 80s and 90s, there was just none of that. I went to school for illustration, and those skills transfer over to a whole bunch of different career paths. But there wasn't actually, like, I never thought to myself, oh, this is something I wanted to do. Even after I had more disposable income as an adult, in my 20s, I was doing a lot of freelance illustration. I was doing a lot of bartending to pay the bills and stuff like that. And I wrote a couple just fan reviews on a site. It was the uh, 90s, so it was the Wild West for the internet. But I wrote a couple interviews reviews, and the executive editor of GameSpot saw those somehow and emailed me and kind of gave me my first foot in as an editor. And I spent about 12 years doing that. And even then, I wasn't really sure about, eventually I started to think, I would like to start making games instead of writing about other people's games. But eventually I did get into the game development side of things, but it wasn't it was very organic. And because I was already in the industry, there wasn't any kind of, lightning rod moment where I felt like I gotta go and make stuff like this because it just didn't seem like a realistic thing, especially because for a long time games, you know, it could have gone the whole Tickle Me Elmo route, right? It could have been a fad, it could have been over, could have been a Cabbage Patch Kid, it could have been a Tamagotchi, games could have gone away, but they stuck around. And I think kids nowadays probably, if they play something and they just feel inspired, now they can say like, well, yeah, people make games, people make indie games, and they have a real kind of like view as to, oh, I want to go AAA and work on Destiny, or I want to go indie and make like a FTL or something like that. So for me, no, but I think things have changed a lot since I was a kid.
I think that's really interesting and also inspiring. Also, like, speaking to people and teaching them about how to get into games is something that I do as well. I remember when I was a kid, game developers were you would see them on G4, if you remember that, and that was about it. So it was like I don't know who a game developer is or where they are or how to do that job. And I remember the small town that I grew up in Texas, nobody there was a game developer. I was like, how am I gonna figure this out? And so I definitely think there's a lot more information out there, and I think a lot more of it is online than what it used to be back then. So it's a little bit more accessible, but it's still pretty hidden, which I think is one of my goals with this podcast is like, who are the people that make these things that we all love to play? But kind of building off of that, I wanted to ask you, writing the game review that got you that opportunity at GameSpot, was that something that you like a passion you had of being a games journalist or like wanting to write professionally, or was that just something you were doing for fun?
Was definitely doing it for fun. There were two reviews that I submitted to this website called animeplaystation.com. It's not around anymore, but what I liked about that website was that they took all their content were basically fan submissions, right? So, but what they did was, which was kind of, most of the websites at that time were like these GeoCities websites. They were just nightmares of like flash animations and terrible backgrounds and stuff. But this website was actually really nicely formatted. Whenever somebody would submit a review, they would populate the review and break it up with screenshots and stuff. So it was actually laid out very well for that time. And I thought, well, I'm buying a lot of games because actually have money in my pocket, and being in New York City, there was a very vibrant import scene, so I would be picking new games up every week. And the two games I reviewed, one was Ultraman Fighting Evolution, and the other one was Bushido Blade 2. And I tried to write them in a way that, you know, at least would read a little bit more professionally. I tried to write like an adult rather than this game sucks, and so I tried to write it like I would imagine a movie review being written. And that's, I think, what caught the eye of this editor at GameSpot. And the other good thing was that that website, when they would credit you and put your name there, they'd put a link to your email address. So one night after I owned a bar at that time in New York City, and I came home, probably 5 a.m., and I would check my email before I went to bed. And then there was an email from Joe Fielder, and it said, "Hey, I really like your Bushido Blade 2 review. If you'd be interested in writing for the website, we'd love to have you." And to be clear, what he was offering me was he was asking me to write for they had a more kind of like community reviews, and community contributors and stuff. Even then, even that seemed like a really cool opportunity because it was a legitimate website, right? So I thought, like, okay, cool. But before I even got to do one community review, I had purchased Theme Hospital on PlayStation 1, and I emailed Joe and I said, "Hey, have you tried Theme Hospital for PS1? It's really cool." And he was like, "Actually, EA has not sent us our review copy yet." And of course I'm holding the retail version, right? And he's like, "Would you be interested in writing our review? We'll pay you $75, right?" And I said, "Wow, that's great. That pays for the game, so sure, why not?" So I wrote my review. That went up probably 1998, 99, something like that. And that ended up being my first review. And because I just kept emailing him about stuff like, "Oh, did you hear about the stuff coming out for Sega Saturn or PlayStation, news from Japan and stuff?" He said, "No, but that's great. Would you be interested in writing that news up for our site?" And I was like, "Yeah." It was a very short time until he said, "If you write 3 reviews a month and once a week wrap up of import news, we'll put you on a retainer." Right? And so they would pay me $800 for that. And I was like, you know, "You're going to subsidize my entire habit." And so I did that. And one thing led to another. I started writing for EGM and GameSpot, and they both offered me full-time jobs. And I eventually left the bar life behind. But it took me over a year to do so, which would be unheard of now. If somebody offered you a game industry job, you'd just take it right then. But I couldn't move because I just opened this bar up, so I had to stay behind at least and, you know, stick around for a while for my partner's benefits. But eventually, that's how I got into the game industry. Yeah, a little bit of a
Wow.
long answer, but
No, no, thank you. I mean, that's definitely what I wanted, is just like to learn your story and your journey. I mean, ever since you kind of started on this roller coaster ride, has it been like sort of taking you from one place to the next, or did you ever have a moment where you felt like, I don't know about this, maybe I want to go back to having a bar doing something else instead of making games or being in games?
well, I definitely never thought like, well, I want to go back into the bar business because that's just a job, whereas what I was doing was a career, right? So there have been times where it's been challenging. I worked at Ziff Davis for my entire professional journalism career. I stayed with one company, was Ziff Davis. I've gone into game development and stuff. I basically still write as a hobby and for fun, and because I have a lot of connections, I get to do a lot of cool interviews and stuff. So I've pretty much written for everybody since. But while I was just working as a website and magazine editor, I just worked for Ziff Davis Media. And Ziff Davis Media went through a lot of layoffs. We had so many magazines, and over time, as the print business went away and the online business became the place to be, we closed down magazines over time. There was EGM2, which became Game Now, and that closed. And then Official PlayStation Magazine closed. That one surprised me. And then Computer Gaming World, CGW, eventually that closed. So EGM was the last one standing. I was editor in chief of EGM by the time we finally closed that in 2009. And also, we had our website, oneup.com. So, every time I would come into work and I would see some of my coworkers leaving the building with boxes, I was like, oh no, what closed today? Right. I was even part of a magazine closure. I was the executive editor for GMR magazine. It was kind of like Game Informer equivalent of EB Games, but when EB Games merged with GameStop, I was get those messed up. When they merged with GameStop, GMR magazine went away after 2 years. And so I never thought, well, do I want to keep doing gaming? Do I want to move into some other field? But there were times where I was like, well, this is really unstable. Do I want to stay with this company or do I want to figure out something a little bit more stable? But, I stayed with Ziff Davis until EGM closed and OneUp.com got acquired by UGO. But, the only time I ever thought, do I want to do something else is when I just got a little bit tired of the editorial side because it was a rinse, wash, repeat cycle where, it was like, okay, here's Kojima. And it sounds really weird to say this, but I was like, how many times can I interview Kojima? Because because I had done really, really biographical features with him for official PlayStation magazine and stuff like that. But once I'd gotten that really cool kind of deep editorial stuff with him done, it just became another PR cycle, another product, and was like, okay, what's happening this time? And every developer, it's not just somebody like him, but he was somebody who I interviewed a lot, and it really became kind of tangible to me that I was talking about other people's work when I really wanted to create my own. I came from New York, worked in illustration, I worked in comic books, stuff like that. So I really wanted to get back to creating rather than reporting on other people's creations. So that's what led me into actual game development.
Wow, that's honestly really inspiring. We had similar journeys. I was a game journalist also, and I'm really excited to learn about your journey because a lot of the things you're talking about, I remember being a fan and like growing up and following games and games media and all this. And around that time, 2009 to like 2014, when everything was making the shift, it was all kind of happening, but from the perspective of a fan, it's not the same as what it's like for people who are actually in the industry or experiencing that. And so, thank you for your insight. Thank you for sharing your story. I mean, I think that there's so much history with the industry from just the past 40, 50 years that a lot of people don't know about. And so, thank you for sharing that. I did want to follow up and ask, like, you mentioned that you were ready to start making your own art and making your own creative projects. Is that sort of when you made the shift to being a developer from being a journalist?
Yeah, around 2008, by that point, I had made a lot of really strong connections and relationships in the industry, and two of the people that I had really, really tight bonds with. One was Tomonobu Itagaki, who was the head of Team Ninja when they were still at Tecmo, and the other one was Tetsuya Mizuguchi, who was the head of UGA, and then he went on to form Q Entertainment. And I had done big cover stories on them. I interviewed them so many times over the years, and we were, every time I would go to Tokyo, we would meet up, we would have dinner, and it was always, we'd talk about real stuff. We would have real conversations. It wasn't just like, oh, hey, I saw you. I talked to him during an interview. It was like we'd go out to dinner. I'd meet Itagaki's family, or Ms. would spend private time with me in Tokyo, and we'd just go out to a restaurant and eat dinner together and have a real conversation, right? And eventually, both of them, and this was the toughest part, but both of them said to me almost within the same 6-month window, hey, I think you should come work with me, right? And I was like, man, wow, right? Two of my best friends in the development scene in Tokyo offering me jobs. And, it was actually Itagaki it was Itagaki-san who offered me the job first. And I thought, I was like, oh, I'm definitely going to go do this. Even though they work those crazy Japanese crunch time hours and they all smoke and the studio smells just like an ashtray. I was like, ugh, right? But then Mizuguchi-san came along only a few months later, a couple months later, and said like, I'm working on this game called Child of Eden, and he showed me a tech demo of it, and he said, I think you should come work with us. This is what you were meant to do. And I was like, Gosh,
What
I
am I
wish
gonna
you had
do?
asked me before. And I had to sit there and deliberate over this, and I had to talk to my fiance. I was like, what do you think I should do? I'm gonna have to say no to somebody here, and this is gonna be terrible. Especially since Itagaki-san really felt like I was on board, and I was. But we were also gonna have a new baby, our
Oh,
first baby,
cute.
and I was like, well, if I go with the Team Ninja offshoot, which ended up being Valhalla, they made the game Devil's Third. I'm definitely in. I heard all the stories about like their team. They would the developers would spend a week at work. They'd sleep under their desk. Everybody had a sleeping bag under their desk, and they just pass out, wake up, and just get back to the desk and just continue away. Or I could work on smaller, nimbler games that don't have that big budget, like the Ninja Gaiden series and stuff, and they're more music based. And I'm a DJ, so music is such a huge part of my life. So ultimately, I went to Q Entertainment to work on Luminous and Child of Eden and those kinds of games. And it was the right choice because by the time I left Q Entertainment, I had a few games under my belt, whereas Valhalla still hadn't shipped their first and only game until I had already moved to Kyoto and then moved back to New York. I know it's a tough situation for them. So professionally and personally, I made the right move, but that was a really hard thing to have to say no to, any opportunity like that in Tokyo. So
Yeah, I mean, two very close personal friends. I'm sure that was a really hard decision to make.
yeah, but we're still super tight, and I'm still working with Itagaki-san on some unannounced projects. So it didn't harm our relationship, but it was definitely it was like trying to tell somebody you're going to break up with them. It's like, it's not you, it's me,
But like literally, it's me. Yeah,
Yeah, no, it was tough, but he took it well and he understood.
I'm glad that you guys are still really close. I did have a question. Like a lot of what we're talking about is sort of forging your path and also finding a way to create a path that works for you, even if there is some instability around. I mean, I know that there's a lot of instability in the industry today. And since you give people insight on how they could build careers in games, I wanted to ask you like what advice would you have to young developers now, like folks who are in the industry and maybe they're feeling uncertain about whether or not they want to stay? Like what advice would you give to them?
I think that staying independent and making your own way through things it's challenging. You're sort of in control of your own destiny. The hard part for younger developers who want to make games is that they don't often know the steps necessary to successfully create and ship a game. Shipping the game is the hardest thing. But when I formed my own team, Tigertron, and we worked on Jupiter and our game Jupiter and Mars. Just getting it out was important. It didn't sell well, but the important part was that we shipped it because other opportunities opened up because we did actually have something to show for it, and now we have a few more games under our belt. But keeping your independence is really, really important. I mean, it's if you can get an industry job, if you can work on a small team or a big team or a AAA team, that's great because you will learn from it, and that kind of experience is super good. I know a lot of people that I used to work with. They went on to other teams as like community managers, but eventually they learned the ropes, the tricks of the trade. They became more trusted and they moved up internally. So for a lot of people, I would say if you want to work for a big studio, don't be afraid of going in at weird angles, right? Community manager, QA tester, whatever, because you can work your way up. And you can, a lot of the producers that I know in the industry, they all started in QA, right? But because they knew what they were talking about, and they had valuable ideas and things to contribute to the game's development. People move around so much that there's always ways to be upwardly mobile. But that said, if you have the I don't know, if you have the ability to make your own games, if you're a good engineer and you can work with Unreal or Unity or Game Maker or one of the other game engines, and you have the wherewithal to kind of make your own dreams, your own ideas manifest. I also really strongly encourage that because, as we've seen this year, AAA has just been decimated. Every time another big publisher comes along and acquires a smaller developer, I'm just like, oh no, what's going to happen now, right? And it's all only a matter of time, it feels like. So, the smaller you are and the more self-sufficient you are, the more insulated you are from that, and you can kind of control your own destiny. But you know, I think, especially if you're a college student, you should definitely be trying and experimenting and going to game jams and seeing what it takes to kind of like, come up with the idea, execute the idea, and create the whole package. There's so many ways to go about it, and there's so many ways into the industry, that it really depends on what the individual is interested in. If they feel like, oh, I want to make Doom, right? Or if I want to make Final Fantasy or something like that, you know, cool, go apply for those things. But if the AAA big publisher route doesn't work out, I mean, look at games like, all these cool games that came out of nowhere that are just amazing, like whether it's Black Myth, Stellar Blade, Claire Obscura, sure I got that name wrong, but there's all these amazing AAA looking games that came out from studios that have basically made their first game together. So there's so many ways to go about it.
Really powerful insight. Thank you so much. And James, this has been so much fun. I honestly could keep talking to you because I'm loving this interview, but we're almost out of time. I did want to ask before we go, if people want to follow you and see what you're working on, keep up with you, where can they find you online?
Probably the best place is Blue Sky, where I'm always talking shit. My handle is Milkman, whatever BKSY dot social. Yeah, so Milkman dot Bluesky dot social. You just look up Milkman. I got the handle like when it was still like invite only, so I nailed it before
Nice.
if somebody else came along and nabbed that. So you could find me pretty easily there.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And thank you all so much for listening. I've been your host, Carmen Askerneese. You can find me at Carmen Askerneese on Blue Sky, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also find me on Substack at The Save Point. I'd love for you to join our colorful community. If you're watching on a video platform, be sure to like and subscribe for more episodes like this one. If you subscribe to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or another podcasting site, leave a review. It really helps the show grow, and I'd really appreciate it. Let me know in the comments who you'd like to see on future episodes and what you thought. And if you have any questions, just let me know. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you for having me.